Though gender and class provide a unique perspective into discriminatory and predatory practices, race always functions as the key limiting variable that dictates socioeconomic status in the United States. A racial caste system was developed based on the color of one's skin. By distinguishing the color to a race, an economic asset was created which essentially assigned value to a race deemed less than human. Disparities between individuals were created based on the definition of race. The separation of race was an influential factor ascribing class amongst women, creating a hierarchy that women of African descent face daily. The legal doctrine partus sequitur ventrem, racial bound slavery to maternal identity, and thus created the permanence of inheritable slavery as a legal status. The shift from class distinction based on wealth to class distinction based on race was a key transition in the 18th century. The moral sidestep ensured that the United States firmly adopted racial slavery when slave trade was already being abolished in the Western world, setting the events dictating a difference in class of human being. The difference between the upper class in New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies were in the way they delivered agricultural goods to the public determined by the amount of land they owned. The only difference between the indentured servant of European descent and a slave of African descent would be the color of their skin. The task, function, and responsibilities would be virtually identical according to many economic scholars. Race became the key component to whether you could pay off debts or become free labor perpetuity. Virginia state law also deemed that cultural and religious changes meant to humanize slaves could not separate the fact that they will and forever be property. Immigrants and migrants were constantly belittled and harassed for being different, even if those differences were minuscule. This was no longer a black and white issue, but a white or lack thereof issue. Asian immigrant workers who immigrated to work on railroads and had generations of children who practiced the same religion and spoke the same as their white counterparts. The growth of economy and the need for more workers increased during the industrial age. Therefore, immigration was another issue that many Americans could not agree on. Most larger urban cities strengthened their political policies towards immigration to draw cheap labor from other countries. The increase of industrial capitalism realized the greatest profits and advances that existed in the modern world. The appearance of poverty with simultaneous progress shocked the consciousness of the 19th century Americans simply due to the unprecedented inequalities. Industrialization and reconstruction changed the way both men and women earn money. This only complicated gender normalities in the workplace. The realization that poorer working class families would have to have their women and children work became a staple that pushed women into the work field. Excluding blacks from rights like voting, attending well-equipped schools, and providing the basic necessities would become the building blocks of institutionalized racism. By saying who could and could not identify as white would dictate the future of the United States of America. Rich, freeborn African American men who participated in wars not being able to vote legally but legally taxed by the government. The industrial age brought an unprecedented growth to the economy by the 20th century. Unfortunately, when the stock market crashed in the 1920s, the Great Depression arrived. This accelerated the vast gap between the rich and the poor. Companies fired droves of their employees, and families were driven out of their homes and forced to migrate elsewhere, often by foot. The Great Depression lasted from the late 1920s to the late 1930s, preempting World War II. President Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1963 through Congress that barred segregation in public accommodations and outlawed discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, and national or religious origin. Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act banned employment discrimination based on sex, in addition to race, color, religion, and national origin. Women, led by the black feminists, used these protections to move eventually into traditionally male occupations, politics, and corporate management. Although segregation has ended, many states had refused to integrate many local citizens, and politicians held great animosity towards the black populace. This manifested with many town officials refusing black students from entering public institutions for education. Most famously visualized when 9 black children integrated Little Rock Central High School to jeers and threats of violence. The landmark decision Roe v. Wade struck down a Texas law that prohibited abortion in all cases when a mother's life was not in danger. The court's decision reasoned that this right of privacy is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. Thus, they held that states could not interfere with a woman's right to an abortion during the first trimester of pregnancy and could only fully prohibit abortions during their third trimester. The single most important factor between the 17th and 21st century is race. Although this is a constant issue plaguing this great nation, it is an issue that has to be addressed in order for the United States to grow. After this great nation elected President Obama for 2 terms, the nation responded by falling back into many of the sociological detriments by electing President Trump. With the recent election of President Joe Biden and the first female, black, and Indian vice president in this nation's history, the nation is trending back in the right direction.